I'll start my introduction. Welcome, everybody. On the background, there is frantic trying to find slides and find a way to get them on screen, because after all, this is for people researching technology. So why should this be easy, right? Welcome to our monthly seminar series. It's June. It's the last one of the season. It's a little earlier than you're used. Usually we're at the end of the day, but this has everything to do with the geolocation of our speaker for today, who is in Australia. So welcome to Kobi Leins, who will be giving a talk to us on her book, New War Technologies and International Law, the legal limits to weaponizing nanomaterials. This is the last seminar of this season. I think we had a very good run. We had very good, open and nice conversations, and I'm really looking forward to this particular talk to close it off for the year. My name is Dennis Broeders. I am a professor of global security and technology at Leiden University. And you see my colleagues, Monica Kaminska, who is the brain behind this operation, and Francois Delarue, who will be giving a short first comments to sort of kick off the debate after Kobi has done her talk. Maybe a tiny bit about the Hague Program for International Cybersecurity. That is the program that is organizing this. We're an interdisciplinary program for the study of international cybersecurity, with an emphasis on cyber conflict below the threshold and the role of emerging technologies. And this is obviously where Kobi fits in really well with what we do. We don't just study the conflict itself or the development themselves. We're also very interested in the international governance of it. So what does that mean in terms of international law, in terms of norms, in terms of strategy, in terms of diplomacy? And that's also where Kobi's book is a good fit, because she doesn't just look at this development, she looks at it through a framework of, okay, how does it fit in governance, or more specifically, how does it fit in international legal frameworks? So we're very happy she's here. She is a senior visiting research fellow at King's College London and an expert for Standards Australia, providing technical advice to the International Standards Organization on forthcoming AI standards. She has many more impressive things on her CV. I will not read them out all, but also worth mentioning, I think, is she's also a non-resident fellow of the Unidir Institute, and that's also a very relevant place where these kind of conversations are out. She comes to talk here about her book, like I said, New War Technologies and International Law, the legal limits to weaponizing nanomaterials. It is out there. It has beautiful artwork. You can see it in the background where she, double. So be inspired today and go out and get it, I would say. We had a short summary of the book on the website, and this is probably why you take it in. I'm not going to repeat that, but I'm going to read out one sentence because it's a good teaser, I think. It's the sentence that says, "Some applications of nanomaterials by the military are both powerful and subtle. They have neurological and biological applications. Devices that can infiltrate electronics and seize control at crucial moments, artificial disease agents that can rest harmlessly in victims' bodies until activated by an external signal." That's that gives me a lot of wondering about where this world is heading, and I think we are very lucky to have Kobi with us, who has on the ground tech help, I think. So we're gonna see where we are. How this works is Kobi's gonna get her slides working magically in about 2 seconds, or either we will gonna try to do this. Kobi will speak for 20 to 30 minutes like that, and then Francois Delarue will have some initial questions to sort of start off the discussion, and then we'll open it up for discussion with the floor, with everyone who's here. Usually it's very open, so we'll see where it gets us, and after an hour we tend to stop when the discussion is still going, because that is a good point to stop, I think. Kobi, are you ready?
Nearly, just 30 seconds. Or if Francois has them, oh, even better. Fantastic.
Kobi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks. I've, as you say, people who research technology and actual technology, but I've never had that issue before, and I'm not sure what happened. So anyway, thank you very, very much for having me. I'm very grateful to you for hosting me, and I really hope that I can provide some context and an interesting conversation. I'm really interested in your feedback, because as you indicated, I am residing in the far-flung Oh, they've gone, Francois.
I've lost the slides now. Oh,
that's okay. Everyone's seen me. They know who I am, so that doesn't really matter. Yes, it's been a long 2.5 years in Australia, and I'm really looking forward to having the feedback of those who are here. So the framing is a little bit provocatively, and in the book, I suppose it's also relevant to come to why I started to write this book, was that I attended a lot of conferences where a lot of people would talk about standard technologies, and having worked in disarmament for years, I'd heard all of these conversations, and then they would tack on cyber nano and something at the end, and it was always just sort of an afterthought and never really thought about, and always sort of talked about in hushed tones as though it was something we couldn't really govern and we couldn't really talk about, the same way that tech is being talked about in some ways today, which is the space I now work in. But if you don't mind going to the next slide, Francois, the first thing I'd like to do before I actually get into the heart of what I want to talk about is acknowledge the country that I'm on. And the country that I'm on was never ceded. I'm in Australia. I'm on Wurundjeri land. My city is actually called Naarm in the original language. And what you can see here is one of the oldest engineering sites. And this is sort of how I frame the book, is that technology is not new. Technology has always been used. So these are actually fish traps that were used to keep the fish at different temperatures depending on their size and the use of the fish. This is from up north, not from around Australia, not from where I am now, but in my region, what were used more commonly were eel traps. And they were also very sophisticated and very complicated networks of fishing techniques that we use. So I think it's really important to acknowledge not just the land that we're on, but also that a lot of these systems and these technologies that we think are incredible, that we've been using technology in different ways for many, many years. These same rocks could be used to harm a human. They could also be used to acquire food. And this is the approach that I take in my work, is how do we look at these different technologies in a way that's really meaningful. So nano means a lot of things to different people. I'm going to define it first because I was unfortunately trained as a lawyer. I need to define the words that I use, and I spend a lot of my days in my job getting people to explain the words that they're using and being clear that they're talking to each other and not past each other. So if you don't mind moving to the next slide, Francois, there's a little arrow down the bottom to click on. There's a bit of a fancy transition. So nano is what matter does at the tiniest scale. And I can talk to you, for those of you who are mathematicians, it's 10 to the power of 9. For those of you who think more in words, it comes from the term vavot, which is, sorry for those who speak Greek properly, but means dwarf in Greek. It's the smallest scale, and it's the scale at which a lot of our bodily functions operate. So obviously it's not new. Matter has existed at the nanoscale for a very, very long time. If you want a visualization, it's what an apple is to the size of the earth, or about 80,000 times across one single human hair. So really, really tiny. Tiny doesn't even capture it. It's obviously beyond sight. What's different now is, as I said, these functions they happen within us internally, but also nanomaterials can be found in sea spray, volcanic ash, in milk, lots of places in nature. But our bodies have become able to adjust and use or interact with these sort of nanoscale materials. What's different now is that we can manipulate nanomaterials. We can actually create nanomaterials and get them to behave in certain ways. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I cover this and why and how I cover this in the book. Why do we care? Like, why have we tried to do this? Partially because matter at the nanoscale has different functions. So some particles that are at the regular size will behave quite differently at the nanoscale. And so scientists are really trying to optimize that. You might have greater permeability, you have greater surface area to inside ratio. You have sometimes greater chemical resistance. It's not necessarily consistent. You don't really know how matter will behave until you actually start to manage at the nanoscale. So it's really a try and see kind of thing. And we're only just learning, and in the civilian sector, there is increasingly regulation around certain kinds of nanomaterials, which we now know are quite toxic. So moving on to the next slide. I didn't want to just look at regulation of nanomaterials per se. I was really interested in the weaponization of nanomaterials. And as I said, this idea of, there are these sort of quantum nano at the end of all of these conferences. I wanted to have a more meaningful conversation about what it would mean to regulate nanomaterials. So I undertook this research, which was crazy. Don't ever do an interdisciplinary project like this. It is really hard. Probably the first year I spent trying to figure out what the framing was going to be. I spent a lot of time in scientific basements reading scientific books and journals because I didn't want to do another gloss over. I didn't want to do another, I'm just going to talk about this in a generic kind of way and, you know, sort of sloppily apply the law. What I want to do is actually do this as though I'm doing a weapons review. So I went back to Article 36 of the Geneva Conventions, which has very, very clear prescriptive terms. If a weapon is acquired or modified under Article 36, it has to be reviewed. And also if it's used in a certain context under Article 82, it has to be reviewed. So if something were like this were to be acquired or modified or used, what would you need to think about? Well, then the next question was, what is this? What do I look at? There are so many applications of nanomaterials, and this ties into my many, many dark days in basements. I don't know why so many of the scientific libraries are in basements at Melbourne Uni and around where I live. But that led to me picking 3 projects. Next slide, please. And I picked these three projects quite deliberately because they were so different. This is unfortunately now topical again. So one of the areas that I chose to look at were thermobaric. And the other thing I want to say is that I didn't want to choose hypothetical sci-fi 10 years down the road speculative projects. I wanted to choose projects that I knew were happening now or were very close to happening now, so that I could actually meaningfully, again, engage in this kind of review from a legal weapons perspective. So thermobarics were really interesting. For those who don't know what thermobarics are, most weapons are when 2 or more chemicals interact with each other. There's an explosion. Thermobarics are different in that they're a material that explodes upon contact with the air. And trigger warning for those, I mean, I should have said these are weapons. So, you know, for anyone who finds this traumatic, this is probably not the presentation for you, although I do have a nice picture of genetically modified kittens later, which will probably console you for some of the trauma I'm about to cause now. These weapons are actually, this image, I think some of you might have seen, this was one of the thermobaric weapons that was used in Ukraine recently. This is not a nano-enhanced one, just to be clear, but I've got an image there because people now know what they look like, which they didn't when I did the research. Thermobaric weapons reach incredibly high temperatures of 2,500 to 3,000 degrees. They shred internal organs, and because they work by using oxygen, they suck any oxygen out of any kind of environment that they're in. And so the effect on humans is indiscriminate. They're often used in caves or bunkers, which are military installations, but as we've seen in sort of city environments, you know, they can cause incredible harm. Having researched normal thermobarics, I then looked at nano-enhanced thermobarics. And so what was different about nano-enhanced thermobarics is that the temperature of the weapon, which seems crazy, but the temperature is enhanced, the explosion or the sucking out of the air, the vacuum is enhanced, the potential damage to the humans are enhanced. So you can actually carry, why does that matter? That matters because you can carry smaller weapon loads with far greater effect. And although these have been compared to nuclear weapons, I really don't like any comparison of any weapon to nuclear weapons because nothing really compares. They're terrible, but they're not nuclear weapons. But this enhancement has impacts. And so running through the different, you know, requirements, sort of looking at what laws apply, this was one category. The next category that I chose, if you don't mind going to the next slide, put horror into the science, technology and society people to whom I first gave this presentation at the beginning of my research, when they said people are doing what for what purpose. Optogenetics is the use, it was largely pursued in the attempt to understand how the human brain works. But opsins occur in our brain and they can be manipulated to act in certain ways. So at the time when I started my research, this was the sort of way that they were being manipulated through external physical contact. Now they can be switched on and off remotely. And again, at the time that I was doing the research, a virus could be inserted in the human body, which would make certain opsins more susceptible in the brain. And then basically you can, using nanolasers, you can enhance or change behavior. And that includes things like making people more aggressive, or at least making the subjects, in this case, rodents, but potentially also humans, more aggressive, more passive, change memories, forget memories. Again, some fairly large changes to the human function. The interesting thing about this is the fact that it's reversible. And so it took me down a really different legal review and it took me into the sort of the human rights, you know, what happens when you're doing, what are the human rights that apply during armed conflict? What are the rules that could potentially apply to these kind of interventions in the human body that may not be permanent, but could have fairly dramatic effect? And again, fairly nascent at the moment, but longer term could really have widespread applications. And you can imagine, this is a sort of a cyber audience. We often think about the software in terms of cyber, but there's also a lot of hardware. And if you could weaponize, the adversary this way, again, without trying to hypothesize too much, there are things that could be done with this that are fairly sinister, and we would want to be thinking about limiting those. However, and I'll get to the end, in the end of this presentation, there is law. Again, there is law. Stop saying there's no law. This is kind of the thing that I get to throughout the book. Once you actually look at the cold, hard facts of the science, then you have to apply, the law, and there is law. So again, part of the purpose of this project was to say we can't say there's no law in this area. The final area that I chose, which seems sort of similar, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, this is where I provide you the placatory image of the glow-in-the-dark kittens. This was not my research project, but this is actually a real thing that people have done, is that they have genetically modified cats so that they glow in the dark. And I didn't know this during my research, which is kind of sad that I didn't. Genetic modification has been looked at and talked about, and in some instances we know that, for example, some embryos were enhanced to be HIV resistant. That was obviously not done with ethical clearance, and we don't know where those subjects are today. But just recently, over the weekend, there have been some really interesting articles written, because CRISPR-Cas9 has advanced a lot in the last decade. So this idea of being able to go in and manipulate a particular part of the genetic code is interesting. But what's really interesting is when you can manipulate a part of the genetic code that's a germline that you're going to pass on to your offspring. So what happens when you manipulate for a particular characteristic that might make a population resilient, or not have certain traits, or potentially even susceptible to certain kinds of interventions. So again, these are not sci-fi, they are possible. When you've seen CRISPR-Cas9 done, it's an incredibly quick and simple operation. So genetic modification had already been around for some time, before the Nobel Prize winners who came up with CRISPR-Cas9 won their prize. The difference was that they could do it quickly, they can do it cheaply, and that really caused furor at the time, and in fact a call for a prohibition on the genetic modification of many substances until there was some ethical debate around whether that should happen. So those were the three technologies that I went through, and each of them were completely different. So the very short version of does size matter is, well, it really depends on how you use it, right? It really depends on the application of the nanomaterials. It really depends on what sort of role they're playing in a weaponry system. Nanomaterials also play an enormous role in things like, very unsexy and not really needing governance, battery life and armor protection, and a lot of other substances and materials that are used in warfare that don't necessarily attract outrage or concern. They're just, they improve or enhance, and they're not really particularly profoundly different. So if we can go to the next slide, then each of these technologies I've separately gone through and said, okay, what are we looking at? So obviously with the thermobaric weapons, you've got more of a focus on the superfluous injury and distinction and proportionality questions. When you're looking at the genetic modification questions, I don't think you can argue that these happen outside of the chemical and the biological weapons convention prohibitions. What we need is a greater strengthening in those meetings to say these are included, these substances are included, and anytime anyone tries to use these materials in this way to alter human function, although they weren't foreseen at the time, the spirit of the, we joke about in Australia, it's the vibe of the thing. The spirit of the law at the time was that this was what they were trying to prevent. They were trying to prevent these kinds of poisonings, changes to biology. This is just a step further. And so throughout the book, there are also a number of stories about how we got to the law, because I think what we often tend to forget with governance is that these things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen, no pun intended with the thermobaric reference, these things happen in a context where people have conversations, and often that context is really important to understand what not necessarily the intenders of the drafters were in a legal sense, but how important it was that this decision was made at the time, and how we can potentially be a little bit creative in our governance and think we could potentially apply some of what we've already got to something that's new, instead of going, there's nothing that applies here, thinking about what we already have that can apply. And again, international human rights law is a really interesting one for these reversible reversible uses of technology where you can actually intervene and then that intervention is removed, what does that mean? I think that's where some of the human rights that apply during armed conflict are really interesting. But the most interesting one for me, and the thing that stands out, is the conversation that we're not having about the environmental impact of these substances. So regardless of the applications, that's probably the chapter I'm most passionate about and the thing I'm most passionate about now. There is an environmental, a treaty called Enmod, Environmental Modification Treaty that came out during Vietnam in response to the use of napalm. And that has lain dormant. I hadn't been active in this field. I'd been back in Australia and I went back to Geneva and said, what's happening with Enmod? And the diplomats in the room looked around at me and said, what's Enmod? And it really shocked me because we forget that these treaties have cultures and bodies and principles and people who support them. And Enmod has been forgotten. It actually requires, I think it's 10 states to get together to reawaken it, to open it up. But what's missing in this conversation is what happens to all of these nanomaterials when they're left behind. And what happens is that they seep into water tables, they go into food chains, they get into humans, and we're only just starting to understand the toxicity. So again, in the civilian sphere, we have limitations on certain types of metallic nanoparticles in sunscreens and other uses. Why are we not looking at that from an armed conflict perspective, particularly when we've got, such high stakes? And it's become even more relevant now, again, looking at Ukraine and the shortage of food. We can't afford to leave enormous food basins toxic permanently. So even if we clean up all the weapons, what's left behind is really, really important. And the standards that we had for toxicity and for international law in terms of armed conflict in the past may not be what we have, may not be adequate now. And I think we really need to turn an eye towards those. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then, of course, bringing it back to be relevant, because somehow this all relates back to cyber. I mean, the thing that I was thinking about in preparing this presentation for you was, I'm really interested to have comments or questions or to think about. One of my critiques has always been that we think about all of these technologies in silos. And so I've now written this very deep, very narrow book on my particular area. But I think what is missing in a lot of these conversations are how these technologies can potentially overlap. And you can see, for example, with optogenetics or even with Thermobarics and some of the others to a certain extent, wherever you've got software and hardware together, you have that ability to intervene. So I'm really interested to sort of provoke the question, or to ask the question to the audience, I suppose, is in terms of how deeply are we thinking about how these technologies interact, and not just cyber and nano, but more broadly. Again, we think about swarms, we think about probably cyber and swarms. Well, there's certain things we think about in partnership more together, but are we thinking enough about the governance of technologies more creatively? And again, this word creatively, I think, is really important. It came out again recently with the Russian ship that was distracted by a drone, which allowed it to be taken out. So that's not how people were necessarily traditionally thinking that drones would be used. But how are these technologies going to be used in ways that are disruptive and problematic that we're not thinking about? And that's what I spend some of my day job doing, but not enough. And then the final slide is just thank you so much for listening to me talk about my project. I'm really, really grateful to have the opportunity to talk to this audience, and I'm really looking forward to comments and questions. And thank you so much for making the slides work, Francois. Thank
you very much, Kobi. That's brilliant. Let's head straight into the discussion and start with Francois, who has been reading your book and has plenty of thoughts by the looks of it.
Yes, thank you very much, Denise. Thank you very much, Kobi, for your presentation and for being with us at this late time for you. So again, I apologize for my voice. So it's not my sound that is terrible. It's just I got a bit of a weird voice. So sorry for the people listening to us. I will try to be as clear as possible. And Kobi answered already a bit my first point. What I wanted to address is why I was interested in having you in this discussion. And first, I think it's very important that we read and we discussed other technology, other disruptive technology that are neighboring the one we are working on. And that was an issue, I would say, for us as researchers, and you said it, is we work a lot in silo and we don't think of what is happening around. So before reading your books, I had read few things on nanotechnologies, but I never really wondered what is the legality of using nanotechnology, what maybe is the implication in wartime, what maybe the policy questions, military questions. On all these questions, on what is very interesting when I read your book and when we listen to you today, is we ask actually a lot of similar questions on these nanotechnologies, on cyber, on AI now, on other technologies. But we never do this extra step, which is to exchange our idea, our approaches, and to see that. So as you say, when someone asks you what is NMOD, so what is this convention regulating the use of force and its consequence for the environment, the modification of the environment during armed conflict, that one of the aspects of this siloed approach is if it's not written on a treaty, we think it's not part of a treaty, or at least it's part of the issue. But we also tend to not look at what are the neighboring dynamics on our topic. So I think it's an important point. I also think your book, for our discussion, and I will come back to that later, is important in terms of methodology and the way you conducted it. So I will have a few questions on that. And I will also connect your book with questions related to AI, because you have been working more and more on AI. And I have a few questions where it connects with cyber and with AI. So I will come back to that. So I mentioned this question. And also one of the points which for me is kind of funny, and you kind of sort of linked that at the end, is I was giving last week a guest lecture at the Geneva Academy. And one of the questions I had by one of the participants, so not in the Q&A, but after, one of the participants came to me and asked me, yes, so now we have this capacity to influence the brain, the emotions of people. How does that relate with cybersecurity? So we see already this question popping, but we haven't yet maybe started to integrate them in our research. And I think yes, that could be also a line of discussion. So on this siloed approach on this issue, for me, it's interesting because you identify what we see also with cyber, which for me is a twofold observation, if not conclusion. The first one is there is a general frustration on the fact from the policymakers on the fact that yes, treaties have been adopted before, but they don't mention cyber, they don't mention nanotech, they don't mention AI, so they don't regulate it. And that has been driving a lot of our discussion. It's still driving a lot of our discussion. And that was interesting to see you have the same issue here. And I would say it's even further because we are still one step behind with nanotech that we are with other new technology. The other element is that you deep dive into international law and you identify that existing framework actually apply and offer a solution to that. And at the end, there may be room for new rules, for new treaties, but it's not really necessary. And I think it's something very important. And again, not reinventing the wheel. So for me, that's also an interesting conclusion, which go to the same direction. We need to look on what we have, see how to interpret it, and how that will translate into the regulation of the framework on the technology. On that, one question I had, or one thing I was wondering about, comparing to what I read on other topics, is you speak very little on the role of non-state actor in the regulation. And I was wondering whether the actors which are, so I think one of the big particularity with nanotech is it's still an heavily state financed, at least for what you are discussing in your project, because it's really state related. I don't think there is that many non-state actors involved in developing thermobaric weapons with nanotech. So it's where also it's very, like it's heavy investment, it's heavy state investment and state control. But still, I was a bit wondering whether there is a role today played by the non-state actors, both maybe like companies will be involved at some point in the development of nanotech. And we are wondering how the regulation we may adopt or we may interpret existing regulation will affect the way they can conduct their business or the way they can develop their nanotech. So that's, and I think there, your comments and your interest on environmental law is particularly interesting. Because what we may discuss about how this technology in wartime affect the environment may also translate into more maybe regulation for civil companies, for civil actors in peacetime on the use of this technology and the effect of the environment. So I was a bit wondering about it. but also what have been the role, or maybe what have been the push from non-state actor in pushing for international law interpretation in this field. And you make the parallel with nuclear weapons and the recent treaty that has been adopted, the ICANN Treaty. And the ICANN Treaty is actually a non-state initiative at the beginning, which has been pushed and which materialized as a treaty. Yes, I was wondering if you had identified similar trends in your work, in your approach, and I would be very interested to hear about it. An element which for me is also very interesting in your research, and I never thought about before, is we speak about nanotech as we speak about AI, but actually it's kind of an empty shell. And this is this overarching term or umbrella term or whatever we want to put. But it's so many different technologies where policies, regulations, and all the questions are so different. And I think the three examples you picked are very interesting because you talk about a bomb that will be highly destructive with like short, long-term and terrible effects. You speak about optogenics, which is reversible. We may debate on the level of reversibility of that, but still it's reversible. It may be seen as limitless in terms of intrusivity. Maybe some things that from a policy perspective may be easier to sell, to say we will use that to actually diminish the consequence of wars, the loss of human lives and everything, compared to a thermobaric weapon, for example. And finally, this insidious idea of genetic modification, which may not be that visible now, but which have effect, as you say, on the offspring of the offspring and so forth. So long-term approach. And that's very interesting because it raises one of these difficulties we have when we approach new technologies and international law or policy of new technology, international security of new technology, is we have difficulty sometimes, or at least to understand at which level of granularity we need to set the cursor for our discussion, for our academic work. But same thing for the policymakers. They have this difficulty to identify on what they should focus on not. And then it creates also a difficulty in terms of us having a discussion with them. And you explained that already in the book, which is it's very interesting, this passage for me, about the fact that in the civil sphere, and when we talk about civil use of nanotech, we have took this step, and now we are more focusing on the different type of technologies. And we have this approach, but in the military sphere, we tend to still see them as a whole package and try to fit this whole package, which is not homogeneous, into the legal framework we have. So I think it's an interesting element. I think it's very important for this topic. I think it's also very important for AI, and that's where I wanted also to have your reflection maybe on what you have learned from nanotech on that, on this question of how to approach the topic and how it could translate on these other technologies. And then I had two questions which are more methodological For me, what is interesting with your book is if I compare to my own work, so I did a book on cyber international law. I tried to do a very broad book with trying to go everywhere with the risk, which sometimes happens, to lose myself or be a bit superficious. You took kind of the opposite way, where you took like you chose three technologies. You really focused on them. You took a more selective legal framework and you really focused on them, which I find very interesting because it's really helped us to follow your argument, to follow your approach. So my first question would be, would you choose the same technology today, or after the years that have passed, would you now think of other technology? I don't know if you have evolved on this point.
I don't know if I'd still do a research project at all, Francois, to be honest. Once you've done one, I don't know about other people, but I don't know that I would go back. No, it was a luxury to have the time to think about it. And in a way, I think this sort of goes to a few of your points, actually. I don't actually think that the technology that I chose mattered in the end. And the story behind this technology was actually that the Australian Defence Force had spent a lot of money on a project that included nanomaterials, and they hadn't reviewed it. And they then realized it was illegal. And they said, oh no, we need to do some research in this area. And so they had a small amount of money, which enabled me to attend some conferences and speak to some people. And like most people doing a PhD part-time or research part-time, I was terrified that someone else was going to do this project before me. So I needed to talk to people in the outside world and make sure that this wasn't being done ahead of time. But I think that the tools that I got from doing this have set me up well. And as you say, I have moved sideways through doing this project. I have moved sideways into researching technologies, because technologies, and I say technologies plural in terms of AI, my gravestone will have the term words matter on it. Like, most of my work has been about defining terminology and helping people to communicate with each other across fields. And so much of this work, and so much of the work I do now, is making sure that people understand that they're talking to each other and not past each other. And so by being narrow, I could be clear that this was exactly what I meant about these particular technologies. The other reason that I took this approach, and as I said, I struggled, and I have to give credit to Rosemary Gray, a friend who walked around Melbourne Uni with me when I was about to completely quit. And she just said, have you thought about this? Because I'd tried every other structure, and every other structure was either duplicating or it was repetitive, or I also didn't want this book to be boring. I wanted it to be something that people wanted to read, not because of citations, but I wanted it to have impact. I wanted it to be something that governments could read, that the military could read. They could go through and go, oh yeah, that's something that we need to think about this. These are things we need to do. This is why I can see that there's an argument. So the structure was incredibly hard. I think if you're dealing with complex and multiple application technologies, the more granular you get, and this is a really good question, and I see this in my daily work, the more granular you get, the more meaningful you can talk about them. But then you have to move back out to the meta and say, philosophically or strategically, what are the risk frameworks that govern those? So not just from a defense perspective. I think there are different framings. And to your point, it's not just the really narrow granular in this that are relevant. Your point about non-state actors is a really interesting one. And I spent some time thinking about this, also trying not to approach this in too traditional a way. And I have used the word creativity a few times. And I think policymakers and lawyers are often quite lazy and not creative enough in terms of looking at what exists already. And this is a deeply unsexy work. It is not calling for more law. It is not, crying out at outrage about the position. It is saying, look, actually, things are kind of all right. We just need to polish some things up and make things better that exist already. That's a deeply unpopular view right now. People are either crying out for more law or saying things are really broken because they need more funding or whatever. Like, this is not that project. This was a project that was actually, I knew it was going to be relatively unpopular, because it's saying what you need is there in front of you, start looking. But what I also wanted to do was bring in, and it's not in this, it actually ended up being a side project, but through this work, I was looking at what the civilians were doing, and worked quite closely with some other experts, including Diana Bowman and Karen Ludlow, who work in this field from a civilian point of view. And I remember meeting with Bill Boothby, and I said, someone needs to write a book on all of the technologies and compare what's happening in the civilian sphere and what's happening in the military sphere. And Bill Boothby being Bill Boothby, he went away and that book was written within 12 months, and that's now on the market. I think we need more of that. Again, the connecting the dots. So when you say non-state actors, I think the lines between, and this is something I've thought about very deeply, the lines between state and non-state, and this applies to AI as well, blur. So the funding for university research is often either defense or industry. It's incredibly difficult to do independent research that's not calling for more research or more funding or pushed in a certain direction. Doing something really independent is hard. And so when you say non-state actors, I think the call for having independent reviews at the end is really a call for that. Part of the problem is that a lot of the people who have this expertise will be either in the pocket of industry so far that they won't be able to be independent, or researchers who need money who'll need to say certain things. And this is a real problem now. If we have people who have such narrow expertise, and the same thing goes for AI, there is a very narrow group of voices. How do you have the plurality of voices? And Anya Casperson cited Pierre Bourdieu, these social silences. We have so many social silences around these technologies where we're not actually talking about what we should be talking about. And I think that's something that non-state actors in this situation with these sort of higher level technologies are not going to be, although they might be someone in a garage, they're less likely to be. They're going to be industry actors, other well-funded actors. We need to rethink how and where we have these conversations. And there are certain conversations we're not having enough, including that there's law that applies. And I would say the same for AI, to your question. When people say there's no law, I was thinking, people say on Twitter, tell me how you don't know about a thing, but don't tell me that thing. It's like, if you want to know that someone doesn't know about tech, just, if just say you want to regulate tech, I mean, what does that even mean? Or I want to regulate AI. What does that even mean? We need to be really careful with the words we use, define the categories, as you say, these really broad category things. We need to be really particular and careful about how we frame them. So I suppose that's a very long-winded answer as to why I went narrow on this particular project, was to avoid being another one of those overarching commentaries without having a meaningful contribution, which was provocative, which was really my intention.
No, that works really well. It's actually a very interesting way to approach. And having this free technology also is very interesting, because the way you approach them shows that something that, okay, it's a nanotechnology, something we cannot really grasp, we don't really understand, but may have very different implications, and then raise very difficult questions because they have very different consequences. And I think that's very important. I think the other element, which is for me very interesting in your approach, and which is something we not always think about, and we need to do that, for example, with cyber more and more, is how this technology plugged in previous technologies enhance them and transform them. And that's still part of the siloed approach we tend to have. We tend to see just it as, okay, this is what I'm focusing on, it's what I see. But as you said, for example, you mentioned the Russian boat that has been, ship that has been sunk in Ukraine, in the Ukraine water. That's the thing, is to get there, part of the action was a drone, part of the action was cyber collected intelligence, and all these elements. And we kind of know that, but still, when it comes to thinking in terms of policies or in terms of regulation, we think of each of them separately, and we don't really think of the complex acts that may take place, and that will affect the way we work on that. And which led me to another question, that will be my last question before I open the floor, but you worked a lot on Article 36. So Article 36 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Convention is an article on the review for new weapons, and how new weapons will be complying with the requirement of the law of armed conflict. And what is interesting there is when they adopted that, they didn't really think of new technologies. And I just wanted to know, what are your reflections on how this article can be, does work, in the sense that cyber, AI, and nanotech are the first time that this question is actually on the table. And when you speak with legal advisor of armed force, they are really lost on how to implement it.
I think this is one of the biggest challenges. And having been to the bunkers in Geneva with, the AK-47s and the bullets and the vats of film that they use to test, for those who don't know, that, the weapons are traditionally, and this is the Article 36 idea, was, what kind of weapon with what kind of bullet will have what kind of effect on the human body. That was sort of the original thinking of, the Article 36. And then how do we sort of use these physical weapons in ways that comply with laws that exist? Again, I think the conceptualization around some of these technologies, it requires us to be a lot more creative. And this is where the Martens Clause comes in. The Martens Clause was basically a preamble that was in the first negotiations. And ironically, Russia didn't have enough weapons at the time. And so they said, let's have a limitation on weapons. And so all the states came together. Anyway, the representative for Russia suggested the Martens Clause. And this idea of not using weapons that are against the dictates of public conscience. Preambles are not legally binding, but from a publicity perspective, that's a really good clause. Like what is public conscience? What we tolerate now is very different to what we would have tolerated back then. So we don't also have to have hard and fast law necessarily. I'm not saying we couldn't and we shouldn't, but getting new law is really, really hard. So before we go there, it's really important that we survey first. But to your point, I think, again, the application of cyber, the application of AI, if you're using it to take out critical infrastructure in armed conflict, that's in violation of IHL. If you're doing things that fundamentally undermine, the tenets of armed conflict, I don't think yes, it's complicated, but what it requires, these reviews require, is people who understand the technologies and understand the law of armed conflict. And I don't think there are enough of them. I don't think there are enough people who understand the technologies to deeply interrogate them, let alone the two fields. And so there's a lot of, I don't want to say panic, but confusion around some of these conversations where people don't necessarily deeply understand what these technologies are. And having sat in numerous meetings where these conversations have taken place, to your point, what are we talking about when we're talking about AI? you know, if I hear one more conversation about the killer robots, it's like, this is not, these again are not the conversations we should be having. It's where is the power, who is funding what, who is doing what is being influenced, where are these tools being used, what is the impact? These are the sorts of questions we should be asking, and doing reviews, I think, in ways that, as I say, the challenge is going to be having people who are independent in a position to do these reviews with these skill sets. And as these skill sets become more and more sophisticated, as I think they are becoming over time, you really need to be so well educated in multiple fields to even interrogate the use or application of these systems. And that, I think, is in and of itself problematic.
All right, thanks very much.